So I can tell you a little bit about my field. I'm trained as a behavioral decision theorist. I do research basically on how people make decisions, both in their personal life and in organizational life. And one of the courses that I teach here at Copenhagen Business School is strategic decision making and entrepreneurship. In terms of what I think is really interesting in terms of teaching entrepreneurs about decision making, what I like to do is really focus on decisions that entrepreneurs make early in forming a venture, and in particular decisions about the team, because we know that the team that is put together is so important for the success of an entrepreneurial company. And the team, of course, encompasses many people. There's the initial founder or potentially founders, so we think of that typically as the founding team. But there's also the investors who might be brought in maybe initially, often a little bit later, but they're part of the decision-making team. There might be an advisory board, and of course they're part of the decision-making team. There might be employees who come in and they're part of the team. And we know that when investors, for example, assess an entrepreneurial venture, often a lot of the focus is on the team. So, of course, they're interested in a good idea, but lots of people have good ideas, and not everyone can take that good idea from just the idea to something that's really successful and working and that grows. So investors know this, and they know what's really important is the team, and that's what they're assessing. And so some of the really important decisions that entrepreneurs have to make early in founding have to do with that team. And so in my field, as a decision theorist, I take the perspective that we have normative models of how decisions ought to be made. And we can compare that to descriptively, what do people do? So what do entrepreneurs, for example, do with respect to these founding decisions about the team? And then we can come up with prescriptive models of how to bridge the gap between what people are doing with respect to decision making and what we know from research, what are better ways of making decisions. And so, for example, when it comes to making decisions about the teams, sort of just as a starting point, normatively, what you should do, what you should consider. So this is sort of a slide that I've put together that I use sometimes for talking to people, is we need, when we're making these decisions about the team, and of course, an important decision for entrepreneurs in founding team decisions has to do with equity splits. And that's one where we see a lot of, over time, sort of disagreement or difficulties with entrepreneurs. So that's a really important decision. But so these decisions about the team, we know normatively what founders ought to do is first they should consider the goals. What are they trying to achieve? And you might say, well, isn't that obvious? But sometimes we don't sit and think, what are my goals, and especially my long-term goals, and we don't take that into account. And what happens is if you don't take into account your long-term goals as you're making decisions, the decisions you make might not be aligned with your goals. And one day you wake up and realize, well, I wanted to get to this place, and I'm finding myself at a different place. And especially what we see with entrepreneurs, what can be difficulty is, so for example, a lot of goals entrepreneurs have, some are really focused on, I want to create wealth. I want a business that makes a lot of money. I want to make money for myself, for my shareholders, for my investors, and that's my focus. For other entrepreneurs, their primary goal really has more to do with control, with autonomy. I want to be the one making decisions. I want to start a venture. I want to grow it. I want to keep it. It's my thing, and that's what I want to do, and wealth is maybe secondary to having my own thing. Some people go into entrepreneurship because of more altruistic goals. They want to help others. They want to help the world. And they might be focusing on certain kinds of innovations, for example, or services they might provide to make things better for others. And that's really their primary goal and what drives them. And where entrepreneurs can get into trouble is if they've made decisions along the way that aren't consistent with that goals. And then, for example, one thing that can happen is you might start a venture, you might grow it, you might do really well with that, and then one day your investors kind of knock at the door and say, you've done a great job, and now you're big enough that we need a different kind of CEO. We want you to step aside. And that's where sometimes founders find, oh, my goal really was about autonomy and control and my thing. But I've made these decisions consistent with wealth being my primary goal, and of course that's my investor's primary goal. And I didn't make decisions right along the way to get me to where I want to be. So that's why it's important to be thinking about those goals. What am I trying to achieve long term? And so normatively, so of course we want to consider our goals. Then normatively we know that in terms of these founders' decisions, founders really should consider what is the need for, we talk about these three things: human capital, social capital, and financial capital. So human capital is sort of what does the entrepreneur bring in terms of their knowledge, in terms of their industry background, in terms of their educational background. What are their competencies and their abilities that they bring to this? So you want to think, what do we need? What competencies and abilities do we need to make this thing a success? They also need to consider the need for social capital. What kind of networks do we need to make this a success in terms of who are my customers, who are my clients, who might give me money, who might be suppliers for the things that I need. And so you need to think about your social network and what are the needs. And if you don't have those, then you might need to bring those in through other team members. We need to consider what is the financial capital that I bring to this. What kind of money, what resources do I have, what resources do I need, right? So you consider what is the need for human capital, social capital, and financial capital. And then you consider, well, what do I have in terms of my competencies and knowledge? What do I have in terms of a network? What do I have in terms of financial capital? And so where there's a gap, if I don't have those myself, then I need other team members to bring that, either co-founders or employees or perhaps investors would typically be where we try to find these different things. A third sort of decision then, in terms of if you have co-founders, of course, is how do you split equity? And this is one that we know this is a really difficult decision, and it's the one that's most likely to make people have hurt feelings or be angry. It's the one that's often most likely to cause, really severe problems, especially with first-time entrepreneurs and young entrepreneurs. Is the default decision is, well, we'll split it equally. We'll do it early, and we'll do it equally. Or maybe we'll give the person who had the idea a little bit extra, but it'll be mostly equal. And then over time, what often happens is people grow, people evolve, and especially again with young entrepreneurs, they might be starting families, or they might find it's difficult to sort of dedicate all of their time to this venture, and they need maybe a part-time job or even a full-time job on the side. And then the founders can start to feel like, well, we shouldn't have made that decision so early. We shouldn't have done it that way. We did it too simply. So we do know through research that there are ways, there are sort of models, more maybe prescriptive models we can bring to bear, or best practices, if you will, to help entrepreneurs make these decisions. So I guess those are the main things you want to sort of think about: past contributions, expected contributions, what kind of financial contributions have each of the partners made, and what are the opportunity costs. So you might do sort of a weighted model, a decision model, to say, well, what seems to be most fair? And so we have some models that founders might want to look at to consider that kind of a decision. They might also want to consider things like reconsidering equity periodically, to say we know that things are going to change and evolve, and so we agree we'll come together periodically to revisit this and to make some adjustments. Or entrepreneurs can consider options to maybe vest, where we agree you'll earn your equity over time if you reach certain goalposts. But without really thinking that through, and maybe even having a little bit of maybe some workshops or some education to sort of help entrepreneurs know that these things are that they often cause problems for entrepreneurs, and to know that we have sort of best practices that we might suggest and ways we can suggest that they think about it. And you might think about this decision, you might go through this whole process, think about these things, and still decide that the best thing is 50-50, or 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, or a little bit extra to the idea person. But it's better to come to that conclusion having thought it through carefully, as opposed to just, well, it was the easy thing to do. It was the obvious thing to do. It was the default thing to do. And that's what we often see entrepreneurs doing, is just sort of, well, it seemed obvious, and we didn't really think it through, and now we're sorry that we didn't.